From the Shadows by Vicki, Ruiz, Chapter 2, Confronting America. As a child, Elsa Chavez confronted a moral dilemma. She wanted desperately to enjoy the playground equipment close to her home, El Paso Segundo Barrio. The tempting slides, swings, and jungle gym seemed to call her name. However, her mother would not let her near the best playground, and for many years the only playground in the barrio. Even a local priest warned Elsa and her friends that playing there was a sin. The playground was located within the yard of the Rose Gregory Houchin settlement, a Methodist community area center. While one group of Americans responded to Mexican immigration by calling for restriction and deportation, other groups mounted campaigns to Americanize the immigrants. From Los Angeles, California to Gary, Indiana, state and religious-sponsored Americanization programs swung into action. Imbued with the ideology of the melting pot, teachers, social workers, and religious missionaries envisioned themselves as harbingers of salvation and civilization. Targeting women and especially children, the vanguard of Americanization placed their trust in the rising generation, unquote. As Pearl Ellis of the Covina City Schools explained in her 1929 publication, Americanization Through Homemaking, since the girls are potential mothers and homemakers, they will control in a large measure the destinies of their future families, unquote. She continued, it is she who sounds the clarion call in the campaign for better homes. A growing body of literature on Americanization in Mexican communities by such scholars as George Sanchez, Sarah Deutsch, Gilbert Gonzalez, and myself suggest that church and secular programs shared common course offerings and curricular goals, perhaps taking their cue from the regimen developed inside progressive era settlement houses. Americanization projects emphasized classes in hygiene, civics, cooking, language, and vocational education. Examples, sewing and carpentry. Whether seated at a desk in a public school or on a sofa at a Protestant or Catholic neighborhood house, Mexican women received similar messages of emulation and assimilation, while emphasizing that the curriculum should meet the needs of these people, unquote. One manual proclaimed with deepest sincerity that a goal of Americanization was to enkindle a greater respect for our civilization, unquote. Examples of Americanization efforts spanned the Southwest and Midwest, from secular settlements in Watts, Pasadena, and Riverside to Hull House in Chicago. In addition, Catholic neighborhood centers such as Friendly House in Phoenix combined Americanization programs with religious and social services. Protestant missionaries furthermore operated an array of settlements, health clinics, and schools. During the first half of the 20th century, the Methodist Church sponsored 1 hospital, 4 boarding schools, and 16 settlements, community centers, all serving a predominantly Mexican clientele. 2 of these facilities were located in California, 2 in Kansas, 1 in New Mexico, and 16 in Texas. Though there are many institutions to compare and overview, by its very nature would tend to privilege missionary labors and thus once again place Mexican women within the shadows of history. By taking a closer look at one particular project, the Rose Gregory Houchin settlement, one can discern the attitudes and experiences of Mexican women themselves. This chapter explores the ways in which Mexican mothers and their children interacted with the El Paso settlement, from utilizing selected services to claiming American, quote, identities, from taking their babies to the clinic for immunizations, to becoming missionaries themselves. Using institutional records raises a series of important methodological questions. How can missionary reports, pamphlets, newsletters, and related documents emulate the experiences and attitudes of women of color? How do we shift through the biases, the self-congratulation, and the hyperbole to gain insight into women's lives? What can these materials tell us of women's agencies within and against larger social structures? I am intrigued, actually obsessed is a better word, with questions involving decision-making, specifically with regard to acculturation. What have Mexican women chosen to accept or reject? How have the economic, social, and political environments influenced the acceptance or rejection of cultural messages that emanate from the Mexican community, from U.S. popular culture, from Americanization programs, and a dynamic coalescence of differing, at times, oppositional cultural forms? What were women's real choices? And to borrow from Jürgen Habermas, how did they move within the horizon of their life world? Unquote. Obviously, no set of institutional records can provide substantive answers, but by exploring these documents through the framework of these larger questions, we placed Mexican women at the center of our study, not as victims of poverty and superstition, as so often depicted by missionaries, but as women who made choices for themselves and for their families. As the Ellis Island for Mexican immigrants, El Paso seemed a logical spot for a settlement house. In 1900, El Paso's Mexican community numbered only 8,748 residents. But by 1930, this population had swelled to 68,476. Over the course of the 20th century, Mexicans composed over one-half the total population of the bustling border city. Perceived as cheap labor by Euro-American businessmen, they provided the human resources necessary for the city's industrial and commercial growth. Education and economic advancement proved illusory, as segregation in housing, employment, and schools served as constant reminders of their second-class citizenship. To cite an example of stratification from 1930 to 1960, only 1.8% of El Paso's Mexican workforce held high white-collar occupations. Segundo Barrio, or South El Paso, has served as the center of Mexican community life. Today, as in the past, wooden tenements and crumbling adobe structures house thousands of Mexican and Mexican Americans alike. For several decades, the only consistent source of social services in Segundo Barrio was the Rose Gregory Houchin Settlement House and its adjacent health clinic and hospital. Founded in 1912 on the corner of Taze and 5th in the heart of the Barrio, this Methodist settlement had two initial goals. One, provide a Christian rooming house for single Mexicana wage earners, and two, open a kindergarten for area children. By 1918, Houchin offered a full schedule of Americanization programs: citizenship, cooking, carpentry, English instruction, Bible study, and Boy Scouts. The first Houchin staff included 3 Methodist missionaries and one, quote, student helper, Ophelia Chavez. Living in the Barrio made these women sensitive to the need for low-cost, accessible health care. Infant mortality in Segundo Barrio was alarmingly high. Historian Mario Garcia related the following example, quote, of 121 deaths during July 1914. 52 were children under 5 years of age. Houchin began to offer medical assistance, certainly rudimentary at first. In 1920, a registered nurse and Methodist missionary, Effie Stoltz, operated a first aid station in the bathroom of the settlement. More important, she soon persuaded a local physician to visit the residents on a regular basis, and he in turn enlisted the services of his colleagues. Within 7 months, the Stoltz arrival of a small adobe flat was converted into Freeman Clinic. Run by volunteers, this clinic provided prenatal exams, well baby care, and pediatric services, and in 1930 it opened a 6-bed maternity ward. 7 years later, it would be demolished and make way for the construction of a more modern clinic and a new 22-bed maternity facility. The Newark Methodist Maternity Hospital. Healthcare at Newark was a bargain. Prenatal classes, pregnancy exams, and infant immunization were free. Patients paid for medicines at cost, and during the 1940s, $30 covered the hospital bill. Staff members would boast that for less than $50 payable in installments, neighborhood women could give birth at one of the best-equipped maternity hospitals in the city, unquote. Houchin settlement also thrived from 1920 to 1960. It coordinated an array of Americanization activities. These included age and gender-graded Bible studies, music lessons, campfire activities, scouting, working girls clubs, hygiene, cooking, and citizenship. Staff members also opened a day nursery to complement the kindergarten program. In terms of numbers, how successful was Houchin? The available records give little indication of the extent of the settlement's client base. Based on a fragmentary evidence for the period 1930 to 1950, perhaps as many as 15,000 to 20,000 people per year, or approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of El Paso's Mexican population, utilized its medical and/or educational services. Indeed, one Methodist from the 1930s pamphlet boasted that the settlement reaches nearly 15,000 people. As a functioning progressive-era settlement, Houchin had amazing longevity from 1912 to 1962. Several Methodist missionaries came to Segundo Barrio as young women and stayed until their retirement. Arriving in 1930, Millie Rickford would live at the settlement for 31 years. 2 years after her departure, the Rose Gregory Houchin Settlement House, named after Michigan school teacher, would receive a new name, Houchin Community Center, as a community center. It would become more of a secular agency staffed by social workers and, at times, Chicano activists. In 1991, the buildings that cover a city block in South El Paso still furnish daycare centers, daycare and recreational activities. Along with Bible study, there are classes in ballet, folklorica, karate, English, and aerobics. Citing climbing insurance costs, among other reasons, the Methodist Church closed the hospital and clinic in December of 1986 over the protest of local supporters and community members. From 1912 until the 1950s, Houchin workers placed Americanization and proselytization at the center of their efforts. Embracing the imagery and ideology of the melting pot, Methodist missionary Dorothy Little explained, Houchin settlement stands as a centennial of friendship between the people of America and the people of Mexico. We assimilate the best of their culture, their art, their ideals, and they in turn gladly accept the best America has to offer as they become one with us. For right here within our four walls is begun much of the melting process of our melting pot. The first goal of the missionaries was to convert Mexican women to Methodism. Since they perceived themselves as harbingers of salvation as expressed in a Houchin report, our church is called El Buen Pastor, and that is what our church really is to the people. It is a good shepherd guiding our folks out of the darkness and Catholicism and into the good Christian life. Along similar lines, one Methodist pamphlet printed during the 1930s equated Catholicism as practiced by Mexicans with paganism and superstition. Settlements programs were couched in terms of Christian Americanization, and these programs began early. Like the Franciscan missionaries who trod the same ground 3 centuries before, Houchin settlement workers sought to win the hearts and minds of children. While preschool and kindergarten students spoke Spanish and sang Mexican songs, they also learned English, U.S. history, biblical verses, even etiquette, a la Emily Post. The settlement also offered various after-school activities for older children. These included little homemakers, unquote, scouting, teen clubs, piano lessons, dance, Bible classes, and story hour. For many years, the most elaborate playground in South El Paso could be found within the outer courtyard of the settlement. Elsa Chavez eventually got her playground wish. She and her mother reached an agreement. Elsa could play there on the condition that she not accept any, quote, cookies or Kool-Aid, the refreshments provided by the Houchin staff. Other people remembered making similar bargains. They could play on the swings and slides, but they could not go indoors. How big of a step was it to venture from the playground to story hour? Settlement proselytizing did not escape the notice of Barrio priests. Clearly troubled by Houchin, a few predicted dire consequences for those who participated in any Protestant-tinged activities. As mentioned earlier, one priest went so far as to tell neighborhood children that it was a sin to play on the playground equipment. Others, however, took a more realistic stance and did not chastise their parishioners for utilizing Methodist child care and medical services. Perhaps as a response to both the Great Depression and suspected Protestants' inroads, several area Catholic churches began distributing food baskets and establishing soup kitchens. Children were not the only ones targeted by Houchin. Women, particularly expectant mothers, received special attention, like the proponents of Americanization programs in California. Settlement workers believed that women held a special guardianship over their family's welfare. As head nurse Millie Rickford explained, if we can teach her, the mother, to be the modern Methodist of cooking and preparing foods and simple hygiene habits for herself and her family, we have gained a stride. Houchin's Christian Americanization programs were not unique. During the teens and 20s, religious and state organized Americanization projects aimed at the Mexican population proliferated throughout the Southwest, although these efforts varied in scale from settlement houses to night classes. Curriculum generally revolved around cooking, hygiene, English, and civic music, seemed a universal tool of instruction. One Arizona school teacher excitedly informed readers of the Arizona Teacher and Home Journal that her district, for the cause of Americanization, had purchased a Victrola and several records that included 2 Spanish melodies, The Star-Spangled Banner, Red, White, and Blue, Silent Night, at Old Kentucky Home. Houchin, of course, offered a variety of musical activities, beginning with the Kindergarten Rhythm Band of 1927. During the 1940s and 1950s, missionaries provided flute, guitar, ballet, and tap lessons. For 50 cents a week, a youngster could take dance or music classes and perform in settlement recitals. Clothing young sisters in European peasant styles was common. For instance, Alice Ruiz, Priscilla Molina, Adina Parra, Maria Gomez, and Aida Rivera represented Houchin in a local Girl Scout festival held at the Shrine Temple, in which they modeled costumes from Sweden, England, France, Scotland, and Lithuania. Some immigrant traditions were valorized more than others. Celebrating Mexican heritage did not figure into the Euro-American orientation pushed by Houchin residents. In contrast, a teacher affiliated with an Americanization program in Watts sought to infuse a multicultural perspective as she directed a pageant with a U.S. women's history theme. Clara Smith described the event as follows: women famous in the United States history as the Pilgrim Betsy Ross, Civil War, and Covered Wagon women, Indian and Negro women, followed by the foreign woman who came to live among us, were portrayed. The class had made costumes and had learned to dance the Virginia reel. They had also made costumes with paper ruffles of Mexican colors to represent their flag. They prepared Mexican dances and songs. Despite such an early and valiant attempt at diversity, the teacher did not think it necessary to include the indigenous heritage of Mexican women. Indeed, stereotypical representation of the American Indian princess, or what Raina Green has termed the Pocahontas perplex, supplanted and any understanding of indigenous cultures on either side of the political border separating Mexico and the United States. Like Americanization, advocates across the Southwest, Houchin settlement workers held out unrealistic notions of the American dream, as well as romantic constructions of American life. It is as if the Houchin staff had endeavored to create a white middle-class environment for Mexican youngsters, complete with tutus and toe shoes. Cooking classes also became avenues for developing particular tastes. Minerva Franco, who as a child attended settlement programs and who later as an adult became a community volunteer, explained, "I'll never forget the look on my mother's face when I first cooked eggs Benedict, which I learned to prepare at Houchin." The following passage, taken from a report dated February 1942, outlines in part the perceived accomplishments of the settlement. Sanitary conditions have been improving. More children to More children go to school, more parents are becoming citizens, more are leaving Catholicism, more are entering business and public life, and more they are taking on the customs and standards of Anglo people. Seemingly oblivious to structural discrimination, such a statement ignores economic segmentation and racial ethnic segregation. For focusing on El Paso historian Mario Garcia demonstrated that the curricula in Mexican schools, which emphasized vocational education, served to funnel Mexican youth into the factories and building trades. In the abstract, education raised expectations, but in practice, particularly for men, it trained them for low-status, low-paying jobs. One California grower disdained education for Mexicans because it would give them taste for things they can't acquire. Settlement workers seemed to ignore that racial ethnic identity involved not only a matter of personal choice and heritage, but also an ascribed status imposed by external sources. Americanization programs have come under a lot of criticisms from historians over the past 2 decades, and numerous passages and photographs in the Houchin collection provided fodder for sarcasm among contemporary readers. Yet, to borrow from urban theorist Edward Soho, scholars should be mindful of an appropriate interpretive balance between space, time, and social being. Although cringing as the ethnocentrism and romantic idealization of American life, I respect the settlement workers for their health and child care services. Before judging the maternal missionaries too harshly, it is important to keep in mind the social services they rendered over an extended period of time, as well as the environment in which they lived. For example, Houchin probably launched the first bilingual kindergarten program in El Paso, a program that eased the children's transition into an English for only first grade. Houchin residents did not degenerate the use of Spanish, and many became fluent Spanish speakers. The hospital and clinic, moreover, were important community institutions for over half a century. Settlement workers themselves could not always count on this encouragement or patronage of Anglo El Paso. In a virtually nativist track, a local physician, C.S. Babbitt, condemned missionaries, like women of Houchin, for example, or for working among Mexican and African Americans. In fact, Babbitt argued that religious workers were seemingly conspiring with Satan to destroy the handiwork of God because their energies were wasted on beings who were not in reality the objects of Christ's sacrifice, unquote. Even with their own ranks, missionaries could not count on the support of Protestant clergy. Reverend Robert McLean, who worked among Mexicans in Los Angeles, referred to his congregation as, quote, chili con carne, bound to give Uncle Sam a bad case of heartburn. Perhaps more damaging than the racist pronouncements was the apparent lack of financial support on the part of El Paso area Methodist churches. Accessible records reveal little terms of local donations. Houchin was named after a former Michigan schoolteacher who bequeathed $1,000 for the establishment of settlement in El Paso. The Women's Home Missionary Society of a Settlement in El Paso, the Women's Home Missionary Society of the Newark in New Jersey Conference proved instrumental in raising funds for the construction of both Freeman Clinic and Newark Methodist Maternity Hospital when Freeman Clinic first opened its doors in June of 1921. All the medical equipment, everything from sterilizers to baby scales, were gifts from Methodist groups across the nation. The Houchin Day Nursery, however, received consistent financial support from the El Paso Community Chest and later the United Way. In 1975, Houchin's board of directors conducted the first community-wide fundraising drive. Volunteers sought to raise $375,000 to renovate existing structures and build a modern-day daycare center. The Houchin fundraising slogan, "When people pay their own way, it's your affair, not welfare," makes painfully clear the conservative attitudes toward social welfare harbored by affluent El Pasoans. The women of Houchin appeared undaunted by the lack of local support for over 50 years. These missionaries coordinated a multifaceted Americanization campaign among the residents of San Guido Barrio. How did Mexican women perceive the settlement? What services did they utilize, and to what extent did they internalize the romantic notions of Christian Americanization? Examining Mexican women's agency through institutional records is difficult. It involves getting beneath the text to dispel the shadows cast by missionary devotion to a simply Americanization ideology. One has to take into account the selectivity of voices in drafting settlement reports and publications. Missionaries chose those voices that would publicize their victories among Spanish-speaking. As a result, quotations abound that heap praise on Houchin and its staff. For example, in 1939, Soledad Borcilla empathetically declared, "There is not a person, no matter to which denomination they belong, who hasn't a kind word and a heart full of gratitude towards the settlement house." Obviously, these documents have their limits. Oral interviews and informal discussions with people who grew up in Segundo Barrio give a more balanced, less effusive perspective. Most viewed Houchin as a Protestant-run healthcare and after-school activity center rather than as the lighthouse in South El Paso. In 1949, the term Friendship Square was coined as description for the settlement house, hospital, day nursery, and church. Missionaries hoped that children born at Newark would participate in preschool and afternoon programs, and that eventually they and their families would join their church. El Buen Pastor and a few, did follow this pattern. One of the ministers assigned to El Buen Pastor, Fernando Garcia, was a Houchin kindergarten graduate. Emulating the settlement staff, some young women enrolled in Methodist missionary colleges or served as lay volunteers. Elizabeth Soto, for example, attended Houchin programs throughout her childhood and adolescence. On graduation from Bowie High School, she entered Ashbury College to train as a missionary and then returned to El Paso as a Houchin resident. After several years of service, she left settlement work to become the wife of a Mexican Methodist minister. The more common goal among Houchin teens was to graduate from high school and perhaps attend Texas Western, the local college. The first child born at Newark Hospital, Margaret Halquin, took part in settlement activities as child and later became a registered nurse. According to her comadre, Lucy Lucero, Houchin's decision to pursue nursing was perhaps due to the influence of head nurse Millie Rickford. According to Lucero, the only contact I had with Anglos was with Anglo teachers. Then I met Miss Rickford, and I felt, hey, she's human. She's great. At a time when many, though certainly not at all, elementary school teachers cared little about their Mexican students, Houchin residents offered warmth and encouragement. Emphasizing education among Mexican youth seemed a common goal, characterizing Methodist community centers and schools. The Francis de Paula School, located on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, for example, was an all-girls boarding school. Francis de Paula educated approximately 1,800 young Mexican women from 1900 to 1946, and a Methodist pamphlet elaborated on its success. Among graduates are secretaries, bookkeepers, clerks, offices, receptionists, nurses, teachers, waitresses, workers in cosmetic laboratories, church workers, and Christian homemakers. While preparing its charges for the workday world, the school never lost sight of women's domestic duties. Quote, every day, Pa girl is graded as carefully in housework as she is in her studies. With regard to Friendship Square, one cannot make wholesale generalizations about its role in fostering mobility or even aspirations for mobility among the youth of Segundo Barrio. Yet it is clear that Houchin missionaries strive to build self-esteem and encourage young people to pursue higher education. Missionaries also envisioned a Protestant enclave in South El Paso, but to their frustration, very few people responded. The settlement church, El Buen Pastor, had a peak membership of 150 families. The church itself had an intermittent history. Shortly after its founding in 1897, El Buen Pastor disappeared. It was officially rededicated as part of Houchin in 1932. However, the construction of an actual church on settlement grounds did not begin until 1945. In 1968, the small rock chapel would be converted into a recreation room and thrift shop. As the members of El Buen Pastor and El Mesias, another Mexican-American church, were merged together to form the congregation of the Emmanuel United Methodist Church in downtown El Paso in 1991. A modern gymnasium occupies the ground where the chapel once stood. The case histories of converts suggest that many of those who joined El Buen Pastor were already Protestant. The Dominguez family offers an example. In other words, of settlement workers, a Ruth Kern. Reina and Gabriel Dominguez are Latin Americans. Even though both were born in the United States, some members of the family do not even speak English. Reina was born in a Catholic home, but at the age of 11 years, she began attending the Methodist Church. Gabriel was born in Arizona. His mother was a Catholic, but she became a Protestant when Gabriel was 5 years old. The youth programs at Houchin brought Reina and Gabriel together after their marriage. The couple had 6 children, all born at Newark Hospital. The Dominguez family represented Friendship Square's typical success story. Many of the converts were children, and many had already embraced a Protestant faith. In the records I examined, I found only one instance of the conversion of Catholic adult and one of the conversion of an entire Catholic family. It seems that most receptive to Houchin's religious messages were already predisposed in that direction. The failure of proselytization cannot be examined solely within the confines of Friendship Square. It is not as if these Methodist women were good social workers, but incompetent missionaries. Houchin staff member Clara Sarmiento wrote of the difficulty in building trust among the adults of Segunda Barrio. Quote, though it is so easy for children to open up their hearts to us, we do not find it so with the parents. She continued, it is hard, especially because we are Protestant and most of the people we serve come from Catholic heritage. I would argue that the Mexican community played an instrumental role in thwarting conversion in a land where the barrio could not serve as a refugee from prejudice and discrimination. The threat of social isolation could certainly inhibit many residents from turning Protestant. During an oral interview, Estela Ibarra, a woman who participated in Houchin activities for over 50 years, described growing up Protestant in South El Paso. We went through a lot of prejudice. Sometimes my friends' mothers wouldn't let them play with us. When the priest would go through the neighborhood, all the children would run to say hello and kiss his hand. My brother and I would just stand by and look. The priest would usually come and tell us how we were living in sin. Also, there were times when my brother and I were stoned by other students and called bad names. When contracted by Houchin resident, Mrs. Espinosa admitted to being a closest Protestant, as she explained, quote, I'm afraid of the Catholic sisters, and I don't want my neighbors to know that I am not Catholic-minded. The fear of ostracism, while recorded by Houchin staff, did not figure into their understanding of Mexicana resistance to conversion. Instead, they blamed time and culture, or as Dorothy Little succulently related, we cannot eradicate in a few years what has been built up during ages. Their dilemma points to the fact historians Sarah Deutsch and George Sanchez have noted. Americanization programs in the Southwest, most of which were sporadic and poorly financed, made little headway in Mexican communities. Ruth Crocker also described the Protestant settlements in Gary, Indiana, as having only a superficial and temporary influence. Yet even long-term sustained efforts, as in the case of Houchin, had limited appeal. This inability to mold consciousness or identity demonstrates not only the strength of community sanctions, but more significant of conscious decision-making on the part of Mexican women who sought to claim a place for themselves and their families in American society without abandoning their Mexican culture affinities. Mexican women derive substantive services from friendship in the form of health care and education. However, they refuse to embrace its romantic idealizations of American life. Wage-earning mothers who placed their children in the day nursery no doubt encountered an Anglo world quite different from the one depicted by Methodist missionaries, and thus were skeptical of this settlement's cultural messages. Clara Sarmiento knew from experience that it was much easier to reach the children than their parents. How did children respond to the ideological undercurrents of Houchin programs did Mexican women feel empowered by their interaction with the settlement, or were Methodist missionaries invidious underminers of Mexican identity? In getting beneath the text, the following remarks of Minerva Franco that appeared in a 1975 issue of New York Houchin News raised a series of provocative questions. Houchin provided opportunities for learning and experiencing. At Houchin, I was shown that I had worth and that I was an individual, unquote. Now, what did she mean by that statement? Did the settlement house heighten her self-esteem? Did she feel that she was not an individual within the context of her family and neighborhood? Some young women imbibed Americanization so heavily as to reject their identity. In No Separate Refuge, Sarah Deutsch picked up on this theme as she quoted missionary Polita Padilla. I am Mexican-born and brought up in New Mexico, but much of my life was spent in the Allison School, where we had a different training, so that the Mexican way of living now seems strange to me. Others, like Estela Barrow and Rose Escavalier Mulligan, saw little incompatibility between Mexican traditions and Protestantism. Which Mexican woman embraced the idea of assimilation too completely as to become closest Mexicans? As a factor, class must be taken into consideration. In his field notes housed at the Bancroft Library, economist Paul Taylor contends that middle-class Mexicans desiring to dissociate themselves from their working-class neighbors possess the most fervent aspirations for assimilation. Once in the United States, middle-class Mexicanos found themselves subject to racial ethnic prejudice that did not discriminate by class. Due to restrictive real estate covenants, immigrants lived in barrios with people they considered inferiors by passing as Spanish. They cherished hopes of melting into American social landscapes. Sometimes mobility-minded parents sought to regulate their children's choice of friends and later marriage partners. My folks never allowed us to be around with Mexicans, remembered Alicia Mendiola Shellette. We went sneaking around, but my dad wouldn't allow it. We'd always be with white. Indeed, Shellette married twice, both times to Euro-Americans. Of course, it would be unfair to characterize all middle-class Mexican women immigrants as repudiating their mestizo identity. Working in a posh El Paso department store, Alma Araiza would quickly correct her colleagues when they assumed she was Italian. People kept telling me, "You must not be Mexican," and I said, "Why do you think I'm not?" "Well, it's your skin color. Are you Italian?" I responded, "I am Mexicana." Or as a young woman clearly remarked to anthropologist Ruth Tuck, "Listen, I may be a Mexican in a fur coat, but I am still a Mexican." The Houchin documents reveal glimpses into the formation of identity, consciousness, and values. The Friendship Square calendar of 1949 explicitly stated that the medical care provided at Houchin is a tool to develop sound minds and sound bodies. For thus it was easier to find peace with God and man. We want to help people develop a sense of values in life. Furthermore, the privileging of color with white as the pinnacle was an early lesson relating the excitement of kindergarten graduation. Day nursery head mistress Fernandez Fernandez included in her report a question asked by Margarita, one of the young graduates. We are all wearing white dress, slip socks, and Miss Fernandez is at all right if our hair is black. Is black? Sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, the privileging of race, class, culture, and color taught by women missionaries had painful consequences for their pupils. Excuse me. Houchin activities were synonymous with Americanization. A member of the settlement Brownie troop encouraged her friends to become an American or a Girl Scout at Houchin. Scouting certainly served as a vehicle for Americanization. The All-American the All-Mexican Girl and Boy Scout troops of Alpine, Texas, enjoyed visiting El Paso and Ciudad Juarez in the company of Houchin Scouts. In a thank you note, the Alpine Girl Scouts wrote, "Now we can all say we have been to a foreign country," unquote. It is important to remember that Houchin provided a bilingual environment, not a bicultural one. Spanish was the means to communicate the message. The message of Methodism and Christian Americanization. Whether dressing up children as pilgrims or European peasants, missionaries stressed American citizenship and values, yet outside conversions, definitions of those values or of our American way remained elusive. Indeed, some of the settlement lessons were not incongruous with the Mexican Wars. In December 1952, a Euro-American settlement worker recorded in her journal the success of a Girl Scout dinner. The girls learned a lot from it, too. They were taught how to set the table and how to serve the men. They learned also that they had to share, to cooperate, and to wait their turn. These were not new lessons. The most striking theme that repeatedly emerges from Houchin documents is that of individualism. Missionaries emphasize the importance of individual decision-making and individual accomplishment. In recounting her own conversion, Clara Sarmiento explained to a young client, quote, "I chose my own religion because it was my own personal experience. I was glad my religion was not chosen for me," unquote. In Relations of Rescue, Peggy Pesco carefully recorded the glass ceiling encountered by, quote, native helpers. At Protestant rescue homes, Chinese women at Cameron House in San Francisco, for example, could only emulate Euro-American missionaries to a certain point. Always as subordinates, not as directors or leaders. Conversely, Mexican women did assume top positions of leadership at Methodist settlements. In 1930, Maria Moreno was appointed the head resident of the brand new Floyd Street settlement in Dallas, Texas. Methodist community centers and boarding schools stressed the need for developing Christian leaders trained for useful living. For many, leadership meant ministering as lay volunteer. For some, it meant pursuing a missionary vocation. The Latina missionaries of Houchin served as cultural brokers as they diligently strived to integrate themselves into the community. Furthermore, over time, Latinas appear to have experienced some mobility within the settlement hierarchy. In 1912, Ophelia Chavez served as a student helper. 40 years later, Beatriz Fernandez would direct the preschool until 1950. The Houchin staff usually included one Latina. However, during the 1950s, the number of Latina, predominantly Mexican-American, settlement workers rose to 6. Marie Lou Lopez, Maria Rico, Elizabeth Soto, Phoebe Bonilla, Clara Sarmiento, Maria Payan, and Beatriz Fernandez had participated in Methodist outreach activities as children. Soto at Houchin had decided to follow in the footsteps of their teachers. In addition, these women had the assistance of 5 full-time Mexican laypersons. It is no coincidence that this decade of greatest change in Houchin police policies occurred at a time when Latinas held a growing number of staff positions. Friendship Square's greater sensitivity to neighborhood needs arose in part of the influence exerted by Mexican clients in shaping the attitudes and actions of Mexican missionaries. So in the end, Mexican women utilized Houchin's social services. They did not, by and large, adopt its tenets of Christian Americanization. Children who attended settlements programs enjoyed the activities, but Friendship Square did not always leave a lasting imprint. Quote, "My mom had an open mind, so I participated in a lot of clubs, but I didn't become a Protestant," remarked Lucy Lucero. "I had fun and I learned a lot too," unquote. Because of the warm, supportive environment, Houchin settlement is remembered with fondness. However, one cannot equate pleasant memories with the acceptance of the settlement's cultural ideals. Settlement records bear out Mexican women's selective use of Houchin's resources. The most complete set of figures is for the year 1944. During this period, 7,614 people visited the clinic and hospital. The settlement afternoon programs had an average monthly enrollment of 362 and 40 children attended kindergarten. Taken together, approximately 8,000 residents of Segundo Barrio utilized Friendship Square's medical and educational offerings. In contrast, the congregation of Elwin Pastor included 160 people. Although representing a single year, these figures indicate the importance of Houchin's medical facilities and Mexican women's selective utilization of resources. By the 1950s, settlement houses were few and far between, and those that remained were run by professional social workers, implemented by a growing Latino staff. Client-initiated changes in Houchin policies brought a realistic recognition of the settlement as a social service agency rather than a religious mission. During the 1950s, brochures describing the day nursery emphasized that while children said grace at meals and sang Christian songs, they would not receive in any way indoctrination regarding Methodism. In fact, at the parents' request, Newark nurses summoned Catholic priests to the hospital and baptized premature infants. Client desire became the justification for allowing the presence of Catholic clergy, a policy that would have been unthinkable in the not-too-distant past. Finally, in the new Houchin Constitution of 1959, all mention of conversion was dropped. Instead, it conveyed a more ecumenical, non-denominational spirit. For instance, the goal of Houchin settlement was henceforth to establish a Christian democratic framework for individual development, family solidarity, and neighborhood welfare. Settlement activities also became more closely linked with the Mexican community during 1950s. Houchin was the home of 2 LULAC chapters, one for teenagers and one for adults. The League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, was the most visible and politically powerful civil rights organization in Texas. Carpentry classes, once the preserve of males opened the doors to young women. Although on a gender-segregated basis, Houchin workers moreover made veiled references to the very dangerous business of Juarez abortion clinics. However, it appears unclear whether or not the residents themselves offered any contraceptive counseling. During the early 1960s, however, the settlement, in cooperation with Planned Parenthood, opened a birth control clinic for married women. Indeed, a Houchin contraception success story was featured on the front page of a spring newsletter. Quote, Mrs. G, after having her 13th and 14th children enrolled in our birth control program, or birth control clinic, now for 1.5 years, she has been a happy and non-pregnant mother, unquote. Certainly Houchin had changed with the times. What factors accounted for the new direction in settlement work? The evidence on the baptism of premature babies seemed fairly clear in terms of client pressure. But to what extent did other policies change as the result of Mexican women's input? The residents of Segundo Barrio may have felt more comfortable expressing their ideas, and Latina settlement workers may have exhibited a greater willingness to listen. Indeed, Mexican clients, not missionaries, set the boundaries for interaction, creating the public space of settlements and community centers. Advocates for Americanization sought to alter the life world of Mexican immigrants to reflect their own idealized versions of life in the United States. Settlement workers can be viewed as the narrators of lived experience, as Houchin records reflected the cognitive construction of missionary aspirations and expectations. In other words, the documents revealed more about the women who wrote them than those they served. At another level, one could interpret the cultural ideals of Americanization as an indication of an attempt at what Jürgen Habermas has termed intercolonization. Yet the failure of such projects illustrates the ways in which Mexican women appropriated desired resources, both material, infant immunization, and psychological self-esteem, while in the main rejecting the ideological messages behind them. The shift in Houchin policies during the 1950s meant more than a recognition of community needs. It represented a claiming of public space by Mexican women clients. Confronting Americanization brings into sharp relief the concept I have termed cultural coalescence. Immigrants and their children pick, borrow, retain, and create distinctive cultural forms. There is no single hermetic Mexican or Mexican-American culture, but rather permeable cultures rooted in generations, gender, region, class, and personal experience. Chicano scholars have divided Mexican experiences into 3 generational categories: Mexicano, first generation; Mexican American, second generation; and Chicano, third and beyond. But this general typology tends to obscure the ways in which people navigate across cultural boundaries, as well as their conscious decision-making in the production of culture. However, people of color have not had unlimited choice. Race and gender, prejudice and discrimination, with their accompanying social, political, and economic segmentation, have constrained aspirations, expectations, and decision-making. The images and ideals of Americanization were a mixed lot and were never the only messages immigrant women received. Local mutualistas, I'm so sorry if I mispronounce, Mexican patriotic and Catholic pageants, newspapers, and community networks reinforced familiar legacies. In contrast, religious and secular Americanization programs, the elementary schools, movies, magazines, and radio bombarded the Mexican community with a myriad of models, most of which were idolized, stylized, unrealistic, and unattainable. Expectations were raised in predictable ways. In the words of one Mexican-American woman, "We felt that if we worked hard, proved ourselves, we could become professional people," unquote. Consumer culture would hit the barrio full force during the 1920s, exemplified by the Mexican flapper. As we will see in the next chapter, even Spanish-language newspaper promoted messages of consumption and acculturation. Settlement houses also mixed in popular entertainment with educational programs. According to historian Luis Ano Novoe Kerr, the Mexican Mothers Club of the University of Chicago settlement took field trip to NBC radio studios in downtown Chicago, from which many of the soap operas emanated. By looking through the lens of cultural coalitions, we can begin to discern the ways in which people select and create cultural forms. Teenagers began to manipulate and reshape the iconography of consumer culture, both as a marker of peer group identity and as an authorial presence through which they rebelled against strict parental supervision. When standing at the cultural crossroads, Mexican women blended their options and created their own paths. This is the end of chapter 2 from Out of the Shadows. Thank you.